I'm DJ Schleen. I'm a DevSecOps evangelist. I'm also a security architect. This is a talk about blue and green pipelines rather than blue and green deployments. We'll go over a little bit about blue and green deployments, then get into some of the details around pipelines as well. So my history is quite varied. I come from a background of hacking, and when I was 10 years old, I began ripping things apart and trying to break into whatever I could. Fast forward many years, I've seen different roles in application lifecycle management, ITIL, service management implementations in Europe, and a lot of different enterprise architecture roles. Do you know the difference between DevOps, DevSecOps, and DevXOps? I would love to see what people's answers are to this one. Two of the terms are industry adopted. One is something that I just came up with because it doesn't really matter what you have in between DevOps, DevSecOps. It doesn't matter what you call it. You could call it rainbow, monkey, unicorn, pony. You could call it DevQuaOps, DevTestOps. Everyone needs to collaborate, work together, delivering this quality to our customers.
And DJ, as our very good friend says, you call it anything you want, just not DevNoOps.
Yeah, there's also no ops, and yeah, I like that one as well. It's a lot different than how we develop software in the past, right? Let me address these really quick before I get into the presentation. So DevOps, that's a traditional term, right? That's development and operations working together and developing software together. So infrastructure as code. This isn't throwing code or a product over the fence anymore. This is developing the product in a development environment in concert or together with operations. And this is something that we've talked about for years in application lifecycle management, service management, is designing product for operations, designing product for releasing, and not isolating different environments or different people. Traditional development would be you develop a product, you throw it over to QA, QA looks at it, says it doesn't work, they throw it back to you, and it works on your machine, you throw it back to QA, they're like, okay, it finally works, things get promoted to operations, it doesn't work there, so test and development get back into the conversations, and really that's introducing drag, right? You're not getting that product out to development sooner. So DevOps brings those barriers down and promotes a set of practices of how people work together. It's not a tool, it's a cultural revolution, and it's a process or technique type of practice, right? So DevSecOps is the addition of security into DevOps. And you could say that everyone is responsible for security. And that's one way of looking at it. But if you ask a developer and get down in the trenches and say, hey, do you care about security? Chances are they are saying, well, yeah, but everything that comes over to me is either false positive or I just don't have time to address it. It's not in our backlog. We're not prioritizing it based on impact and severity. Every group looks at it differently. I love to sit down with developers as they're developing code, even just having these conversations with enterprise architects, operations, and get to the point where I know the same language that they do. We spent a lot of 2017 investigating and learning everything we could about Kubernetes, DevOps, security tools that we can plug in. The conversation that we have with developers or the development organization has completely changed, where they don't even know that we're security folks. All they really know is that we can have the same conversations with them, and together we can bring up the security quality of the applications. And DevXOps is a term that I coined, really. It's dev whatever. So this is almost like an all-encompassing term because we talk about culture as the number one tenet of DevOps or DevSecOps. And if you really want to include everything, you could really just call it X, right? And again, the idea is just that everyone collaborates together. As we go through this presentation, if anyone has any questions, use the chat window, post a question, and I'll address them as we go through. So in true DevSecOps fashion or DevOps fashion, we want to ensure that we collaborate along the way. If you don't understand something that I've said or you have more questions about what's going on, after every slide, before I'll go on to the next slide, I'll take a look at the chat window and see if there's something that we can take a look at. So with that, this is Blue's new green. Blue Spider-Man, green Spider-Man. I love Marvel, I love superheroes, and I love reading comics. This conversation isn't about verses. When we look at blue and green, these are separate yet important to each other, the separate concepts. Here's a definition that I really liked from Cloud Foundry. I'll let you read it because you can read it just as well as I can, but a blue-green deployment is where this whole idea of blue-green pipelines or blue is the new green comes into play. And what you're doing with these is you're deploying two identical environments into production. The first environment being a green environment where you're doing your testing, you're doing your migrations, you're potentially putting data from production into that green environment. And you can look at green as almost like a pre-prod or test environment. And then blue is a promotion from green, where blue is the production environment that customers see. The reason why we do that is we can roll back very quickly. When we start talking about DevOps and DevSecOps and just increasing the flow of our applications, a lot of folks get a little nervous about that because we can deploy to production 50 times a day. And a feature or something that we're implementing in our code base, even if it's not complete, the idea behind DevOps and DevSecOps is the flow in our pipelines, or the way that product gets from an idea to value delivered. We want that as fast as possible, and we want things integrated as quickly as possible so we reduce drag based on code breakage. So at any time, one of these environments can be live. So we can flop green into blue, and then blue becomes green, and we can continue this testing. If there's an issue, something breaks, we can roll them back. So here's an idea or a demonstration about a blue-green environment. So we have the deployment, which is that rocket ship. Blue is what the customers at the end of the day see. Green, it can be X. X can be a staging environment where you're doing your migrations, you're doing your tests of your database, migrations, configuration management. It could be a pre-production environment. You can also do canary deployments. So you could have some customers going to the, or all the customers or majority of the customers going to that blue environment. And the green environment could be targeted for a certain group. Maybe that's your business stakeholders that can take a look at that and say, hey, this looks really good. This is ready for deployment. Your business could look at it and say, is this feature complete? Is it operating how I intended? A lot of these things can be caught further left, but this is your final point where you could say, are we going to not accept this, or are we going to accept this? So canary deployment being some customers, even a dark deployment where they don't even know that they're going to this new site, but you'll find out feedback from them that you can introduce into your backlogs and into your incident management or service management systems, where if they don't like something, if something breaks, they'll let you know. And you can also monitor logs and KPIs to see if the performance is up to speed or if there's any back-end issues that are happening. So the risk reducer for all this is you could pretty much have zero downtime. There's never really such a thing as zero downtime because you're going to be swapping the environment. And think about like a domain service or DNS entry. That's really all you're doing is you're switching from green to prod, or X domain to another domain. You're just changing that routing. And then Y, where X could equal Y. Whatever you want it to be, it can be. And that's really dependent on your business. I always have subway maps in all of my presentations where I talk about pipelines or flows or that kind of thing. And the reason being is if you look at a city, let's take for example.
Sorry to interrupt. I've got a question and a comment for you. Michael's asking, so where does user acceptance testing fit into this cycle?
This is either going to be part of that green, and that's sort of your final acceptance, but mainly it's going to be left of this. And I'm not showing anything left of the deployment in this presentation. You're going to have that sooner in that pipeline. One of the projects that I'm working on, aside from everything else I'm doing, is a large, massive DevSecOps architecture that goes through where things can be accepted and even where risk can be accepted in a semi-manual process without interrupting the flow. So some crazy things happening there, but user acceptance, again, is to the left.
And then this one's a little bit of smack talk from Greg. He says if you don't get it right the first time, you don't need to roll back so much or so frequently. Blue-Green is planning for failures. Comments on that, DJ?
Yes, and that sort of plugs into chaos engineering. So one of my good friends, Aaron Reinhardt, he has just formed a new organization, new company that focuses on chaos engineering as part of everything. And that's expecting things to fail and actually injecting failure. So you could run a lot of chaos testing in that green pipeline as well. So yeah, it's planning for failure. It's also injecting failure.
Right, and Simon's kind of chiming in and saying, right, you'll never get it right the first time. And to DJ's point, if you don't try to really, I mean, that sounds horrible to say if you don't try to get it right, but, and then also Kevin's asking, and maybe you'll do this on a different slide, but can you please discuss the difference between deploy and release?
When you think about CI, CD, and CD, release could be releasing to anybody. And that's sort of a generic term where if you're doing continuous integration, that's continuously integrating your code. That's not building it just yet. CI is, so that's what CI is. Continuous delivery is you're delivering that product along your pipeline, and that's where you're doing your acceptance, et cetera. And then deployment is that, release to your customers. That's when you're saying, hey, I'm going to deploy. So this yellow dot in this situation is where you decide you're deploying or where the system is deploying that application. The reason why I do all my diagramming as a subway or looking like subway stations is because if you take, for example, New York, it has a subway system. All it really does is take people from point A to point B. And there's a lot of different stops in between. You can get off, get on. And if you look at Hong Kong, that has a completely different subway map layout. You can't take New York and overlay it in Hong Kong or Chicago or wherever you want to deploy that. You can't do that because it's going to take you in the middle of a field, potentially, or in the middle of the ocean. So each DevOps or DevSecOps team that you have, or some organizational unit that is practicing DevOps, could have a different pipeline, different flow than another part of the organization. Every team has their own path to their own delivery. They know what their product is, they know what their features are, more than the executives, more than the VPs, more than anyone up the food chain, even the product owners or the business analysts who are saying these are the features we want to have in. They know how to deliver it, they know how to build it. I have some pretty controversial views around that, where Team A can use Go, Team B could use Ruby, Team C could use whatever they want, .NET, Java. Those are the languages that they pick, that they know about. As long as it's not Tickle or some kind of language that doesn't really exist like Fortran or COBOL, go ahead. If we can scan it from a security perspective, as security organizations, we should be able to pull back from that and say, as long as we can apply our security governance and policies, do whatever you need to deliver the product. And that's sort of that separation where we're not dictating as a security organization how people deliver. We're telling people collaboratively how we improve the security of our product. So I'm not sure if there's any questions on that before we move on.
We've got one more question, which is, where does the traditional, quotes, change management hook in? Is it all considered low risk and just registration?
So change is going to most likely be to the left of this conversation as well. So this is going to be the introduction of a change into the pipeline. Even an incident, where an incident might happen in production, you want to make sure you're capturing a KPI around that, like escape rate or something to that, like defect escape rate. But if something happens where you need to address an issue, maybe it's your call center coming, somebody's calling in and saying, hey, there's an issue with the product, I can't get into this section. That's going to create an incident, and it's going to come back to the beginning of the pipeline where features come in. That's where you're going to be grooming your backlog, looking at your list of incidents, identifying where the problems are, and then potentially getting a change together that's running through the pipeline. So that's where that kind of thing is going to happen. What you want to do with DevOps or DevSecOps or any kind of automation pipeline is ensure that your release notes are automated. You don't want to have someone getting a spreadsheet together and saying, this is the release notes for this. You want to have that automated so that it's an artifact that can go into your artifact repository, and that becomes like this golden stamp. So each release is going to have a build tag or some kind of release version or build version. Associate that build with that release notes. The hard part about this is if you're releasing multiple times before you eat breakfast, you're going to have a lot of release notes. That's where, if you look at Agile or Scaled Agile framework, for example, we used to have these situations where we'd have 2-week iterations and we'd have a release every 6 iterations. So that's looking at 12 weeks to get a release to your customer, and that's way too long. A couple different reasons for that. First, you're not getting features out to your customers as fast as you can. And if you have a security issue, it's going to be a hot fix and it's a fire drill. Everyone does the office space and comes in on Saturday, and somebody's in the basement with their red stapler. So we want to try to avoid that, and we're doing multiple releases potentially every couple of minutes, depending on the maturity of your DevOps team. Like look at Google, look at Netflix, Etsy, they're releasing multiple times a day. So from a Scaled Agile framework perspective, the end of an iteration is more of a stake in the ground. So you could have a potential release summary for the day that gets created, or a release summary for the week that you can put together. So this is where there's a little bit of challenges from an automation perspective and how it maps to that ITIL process where you're tracking the releases. The forgotten ones. We talked about blue-green production deployments. The conversation that I'd like to highlight is this idea of Bluegreen Pipelines. When people are developing pipelines, and this is, when you first start adopting DevOps and DevSecOps practices, they'll create this tool chain and they'll start with the tools first. It turns into a flaw, I guess you could say. It's the tragic flaw of DevSecOps and DevOps adoption, is where people say, hey, I have all these tools, let's cobble these together and we'll call it DevOps. Cultures first. You have to make sure that you have this culture of trust, that you don't have a dictatorship of technology executives. And that could be anybody, really. You want to have the culture of collaboration, I guess you could say. And then the technique comes from that, and then the tools come together. When you develop a pipeline and you have a pipeline in place, what could happen is you might want to introduce a new tool. So maybe it's a software composition analysis tool or a security tool, like a static analysis tool that's looking at the source code for security vulnerabilities. A lot of times folks will put this into production, a production pipeline, and test it out. The problem with that is things tend to break. So this is where the whole idea of blue-green pipelines come from. If you start introducing change into a production system or a production pipeline, something that you're relying on to deliver your product, you could risk breaking it. Then everybody is sort of shaking their heads and looking down, wondering what's going on. Again, it's a scramble. You don't want to introduce that kind of change without having a record, having that traceability. The 3 ways of DevOps is described or explained in some of the works that Gene Kim has done, as well as the Phoenix Project. If you've taken any of the foundation classes from ITSM Academy, you're going to have learned and been tested on what these 3 ways are. The first way is increasing flow or being cognizant of flow. The second way is looking at feedback loops and having improved feedback loops. And what that is getting information faster. So that's that whole idea of failing fast, shifting left, also KPIs and gathering information about the state or the execution of your pipelines, everything that you're doing to get the product out. That could also be increasing those feedback loops into that whole service management layer where you're getting that information sooner rather than later. Then the third way is experimentation. So this is where you could experiment with these blue-green pipelines. The blue at the top is your production pipeline, and the green is where you could experiment. And you could have multiple green pipelines. So if we take security into consideration, it really doesn't matter the steps that happen before or after, but when you introduce that tool, that's where you're experimenting, and that's where you want to find out if you're going to break or if this is going to decrease the flow. And you can also identify what kind of feedback you want from that experimental stage. Again, that could be any tool, not just security, that you're putting into that pipeline to see what's going on. The second way being that faster feedback loops. And as you can see, I'm going backwards. You're experimenting and then you're determining if your flow is actually improved. So the second way, you're breaking, that feedback comes back, and you could test your ticket creation in a separate environment as well. These pipelines, I love having everything coded. If I can code it, I want to be able to bring a system up, and I want to be able to destroy it when I'm done with it. Having a pipeline as code where you're orchestrating and bringing up an entire environment. So that could be an artifact repository, it could be your build servers, it could be an open source software tool, any kind of tooling that you're putting in there. And that could be all your orchestration or your bootstrapping of your test harnesses or your unit test executions. There's nothing saying these have to be linear either. You could have a pipeline that splits off into 3 sections and then comes back together at the end. With the second way, we want to ensure that if something breaks, that we're testing that feedback mechanism there rather than testing it in a production system where if something breaks, now we've halted our complete production environment. Think about an automobile manufacturer where you have potentially multiple pipelines converging into one. So you have the engine being built on one pipeline or one assembly line, you have the body being assembled on another one, and you have the chassis assembled on a third one. They all come together and then they go out through a linear pipeline. So these organizations will shut down the facility in order to introduce new body types of a vehicle, and they'll retool and they'll test those pipelines out. In software, we have the ability to do that a lot quicker. We don't have to shut down the system just to retool. And this is where that green pipeline helps us retool, test things out, and then swap the pipelines just like we would swap them in a deployment strategy. So yeah, bringing in security into this. Security has this bad reputation of sticking their nose in and dictating. And this is where the practices of DevSecOps come into consideration, where it's a collaborative effort. So you don't want to be the police coming into the environment and saying, you can't do this, you can't do this. I love going into an environment and saying, okay, you want to use this kind of technology, how can we make it work? What are the security ramifications of using this? And definitely calculating the risk level of using something like either low risk, medium, actually quantifying that risk. Because that's what we're trying to do as a security organization is we're managing risk. Risk can come in different ways, brand reputation, breaches, vulnerabilities, all this kind of thing. And we want to ensure that as security organizations, we're not dictating, we're collaborating, we're finding out why people want to use something, what kind of tool sets they want to use, and how can we enable the development team to do things and integrate security in a faster way. The problem is security tools tend to be a donkey where you have to drag them along to make them happen. Looking at a static analysis tool, for example, if you have a code base that has 4.8 million lines of code, those brownfield applications that you're bringing into your pipelines, these are tools that are products that you want to run through a pipeline. You want to have that team adopt these DevOps or DevSecOps practices. You introduce these security tools, and on 4.8 million lines of code, you're holding the pipeline up for 48 hours. This is where we really have to be cognizant of the impact that we're putting into our pipelines by introducing these tool sets. Back to the first way where we're improving flow, that whole donkey idea is a segue into this. In the bottom left-hand corner, and I want to make this actually blow up in my next presentation, we're talking about a stage, and the stage is a task that happens in this pipeline. So this is in particular one is that task that we've introduced that we're experimenting on. This could be a security tool or a non-security tool. So I like looking at the stage duration. When code comes in or something comes in to trigger that duration or trigger that task or stage, I want to track how long it takes to execute. And I want to make sure that I know that, and that's a KPI. And I have a threshold. So if it takes longer than a certain amount of time, I can take action. So that's an actionable and relevant KPI. And we also want to deliver those KPIs to the appropriate person in an appropriate way. So not blasting out an email to the whole entire development organization saying, here's the KPI, it's out of range. That's just creating noise inside of a person's mailbox. Putting a lot of these alerts or KPIs into those chat ops windows creates noise there, and then people ultimately ignore it. So they have to be relevant, they have to be actionable, and they have to be targeted to the appropriate individuals. And also, people should be able to opt out if it doesn't apply to them. But if it's part of their role, they shouldn't be able to opt out. So that's a whole other conversation about managing KPIs and information coming out of these pipelines. So that stage duration, start time, end time, I want to look at how long it takes and then improve that and constantly iterate. So this is the 3 ways coming into that stage: improving flow, faster feedback loops or KPIs that are coming out of it and information being distributed to the appropriate people. And the third way, that we're constantly experimenting on this. And then I like looking at stage lag, and this is the amount of time between one stage ending and another stage beginning. That could be waiting for a queue. For example, getting to the static analysis tool, you're running a huge project through it. You might only have a limited amount of engines or licenses that can process these applications flowing through that stage. So if you're waiting on that stage to begin, that's introducing stage lag. And that's another thing that we want to try to reduce when we're looking at flow. So that first way. Lisa, do we have any more questions before I move to the next slide?
Hi, DJ, it's Nicole. Yeah, actually I have one question. Just a comment, I guess. I assume we need to maintain multiple repositories for multiple pipelines so we can automate pulling from a gold build. It's just kind of a question there.
Yes, and really no. So you want to have everything completely identical, at least when you start. This could be a branch in your code base where you're just branching off the master, and then anything that you're integrating, you could roll back into that. Again, this is all infrastructure as code. So you're also bootstrapping and creating the destruction for those stages that you're experimenting with. So once you're done with your experimentation, you might not have that green pipeline anymore. You might just have that one blue one. It really depends on how you want to do that as an organization. So you could have a separate artifact repository. You can tag them separately. You know, if you're deploying this into a Kubernetes cluster, you could have it separated by namespace, where you're experimenting with configuration, not necessarily introducing a tool set and changing the infrastructure that builds these pipelines. And that could be some of the experimentation as well. It's just changing configuration values and optimizing things. A lot of these tools have multiple ways to configure them and optimize, or introduce different portions or plugins or that kind of thing. That might be a non-code related experiment. So it really depends on your use case and what you need to do or what you want to do from a code perspective, if it's infrastructure as code or software as code or security as code type of thing. Well, let's move on to the next slide. Nicole, feel free to interrupt if there's any other questions coming in. So yeah, blue is the new green, where you swap these pipelines, or if it's infrastructure, you can build side-by-side deployment, and then you're really forking that portion at this screen is to the complete left of this screen, where code flows into that new one, you destroy the old one, and that becomes your new production pipeline. One of the things that we can do too is unit test our infrastructure deployment. I use one tool, Terraform, for infrastructure creation. And one of the reasons why I use that tool is I can plan and see what the deltas are for the infrastructure I'm changing. Based on those deltas, I can modify unit tests that say, when I make this, is this what I intended? Looking at the plan results and saying, okay, this security group or this instance or this VPC, let's say if it's an Amazon perspective or an Amazon deployment, that these are the changes that I'm making, and these are, it's the unit testing that you're asserting that these are what's going to happen. And then you could just automate the deployment, and that scares a lot of individuals, saying, wow, you're completely automating your production deployment. No, we're doing our production deployment. You know, if you're automating that, you're not necessarily automating production, you're automating the green, and then you're swapping them around. So that's where having these test assertions for your infrastructure is great too, because then you're applying these automated test cases to everything. It's everything as code. It's not just security or infrastructure or software. It's everything as code. That's what I think the utopia of DevOps and DevSecOps, at least from a pipeline or development perspective, is going to be, is making sure that everything is coded. One of the reasons why is then you have that life cycle of a change. Changes that get introduced get associated with code. Code gets checked in. You have that traceability from code change or feature delivery all the way up to the artifact that was created that said, hey, we need to do this, or this is something that needs to be implemented. If you have an incident, for example, and it's an emergency, severity is high, impact is high. I also like putting a third variable into there called likelihood, and that's more of a risk categorization for a security related issue. So, are the likelihood of a customer seeing that, or the likelihood of impact severity happening? Based on those three, that incident might say, hey, we need to deploy this right away. And if you are looking at these pipelines and you have everything as code and people are conditioned, or your teams are not conditioned, that's a really interesting term, but they're used to deploying every minute if they needed to, we can deploy or react to these incidents a lot quicker. I think that that's very important, especially if it's a security issue. We've seen things like OpenSSL, Poodle, there's a Drown, all these different SSL or whatever related to security vulnerabilities that happen. There's a Kubernetes one that came about a month or so ago that people really needed to fix. There was a Docker breakout, container breakout issue. And really all that needed to be done was something needed to be patched. So you could trigger that whole rebuild process automatically, or you can create an incident that someone addresses and pushes the code out. And again, this isn't coming in on Saturday. This isn't doing a hot fix. This is just reacting and deploying this as soon as possible. So again, it's reducing the security risk. It's also reducing the risk to your customer of having their information taken. I work in a regulated environment. It's either PCI or HIPAA or some kind of regulation compliance that you have to adhere to. And I'm a customer of our product too. I don't want my PHI or PII leaking across the internet. That's one of the reasons why we want to react to these security incidents or even a breakage, from a feature perspective as soon as possible. And I like putting Thanos into everything. If you're not going to see the end game this weekend or when it comes out, definitely do. So that's my Marvel plug. So how do we do all this? And we've covered a lot in the previous conversations that we've had in this presentation, or that I've talked about. Coding the pipeline, huge. Don't just code the infrastructure that's going out, code the pipeline. I'll be doing this in a project I'm going to be releasing called the DevSecOps Experiment. I'm actually editing some of the first few episodes of it right now. And it's going to be available on DevSecOpsDays.com. It's going to walk through a creation of a lab environment, and it's going to completely automate the creation and the destruction of a pipeline and experiment a lot with different tool sets. Automate the pipeline toggling too. So using ChatOps or something to that effect, where you're like, okay, all these test cases are passing for our green pipeline. Let's toggle it and make it as little impact as possible, and ensuring that A, there's communication, B, it's logged as a change because you're changing the pipeline. And it's also a release, right? When you're branching or where you're creating that green pipeline, it is identical to what's happening in the production environment. Because if you're going to be swapping these eventually, and even from a deployment perspective, it's going to mutate, especially if you're migrating data or you're doing some sort of testing or maybe re-releasing to that green environment. But it's always based, and the deltas are based on production versus what you're changing. So when you initially put that in, that's where we want to ensure that they're identical. So measuring everything as well. Measure your pipeline creation time, measure the pipeline destruction time, because that's going to show you how even changing these pipelines are going to affect your flow. Measuring the introduction of a task or some stage in that pipeline, and then optimizing that and just continuing to iterate through and experiment. I think we have another couple of polls, Nicole. I'm not sure if you want to spark those up.
Yes, we do. And I have one question from Brian before we run those polls. How does DevSecOps work in organizations that don't have sufficient redundant infrastructure for Bluegreen pipelines?
So you're going to be testing in production at that point. I think the answer to that is be careful putting these security tools in and the impact of them. So there's certain types of tools. If you take a look at my all-day DevOps talk last year, it was called Don't Fear the Four Horsemen of the DevSecOpocalypse. It compared 4 different security tools to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It was really fun to do because death is always SaaS because it's introduces the most drag. If you want quick impact immediately with the least amount of interruption, it's going to be open source software management and looking at your third-party components. That is going to be where most of the vulnerabilities come in. 90%, 95% of all applications statistically are open source software. Developers take these components and in a way to increase that flow, they'll leverage this functionality and they'll cobble it together or assemble it together with custom code that they're writing. Vulnerabilities that are coming in are usually through these components, especially container vulnerabilities, things that you're doing in a containerized environment. If you look at base images, I would say 99% of them have vulnerabilities, and most of the time developers will pin a version, so they'll never update the thing. Rather than addressing the technical issue now, they're creating technical debt or security debt they have to deal with later. If you have one pipeline and you're starting to adopt things and you don't have this blue-green infrastructure created yet, start with open source software management, and actually you can run this in a monitor mode. So you just have this ability to see what is passing into your infrastructure and what people are using. Then take it from a security program perspective and say, what do I need to introduce from a program governance, security, control standards or control procedures? And how do I react to those vulnerabilities coming in and help developers identify false positives, potentially upgrade those libraries, reduce the amount of noise before you start putting hard gates into that pipeline. So one of the things that we started doing is letting anything that's coming in with a CVSS score of 10 into the environment. And then we would slowly start reducing that to 7, to 5, to 3. And that was capturing the vulnerabilities, but also allowing the development teams to either select a new component, to update their pinned version and look at the technical data or if there's binary incompatibilities, or to potentially take the source code from that open source component, address the security issue, and contribute it back to the community, which I love. It's where you can leech components or you can leech components and contribute back. Container vulnerability analysis, if you are using or deploying any Docker containers or containers into a Kubernetes environment or bare metal host, getting a vulnerability analysis tool in place will, again, give you the information, and then you can start applying policy to it from your governance or your GRC tools. The other thing that these do is they'll sit on your container hosts or your Docker hosts or your Kubernetes environment, and they'll monitor the hosts for security vulnerabilities or malicious activity or something that's not expected. The impact to the development or the release teams is minimal. It's just a matter of a curl command for some of these tools, and it just installs, and it installs along the side. There's no agents, there's nothing to do from a development perspective, but it gives you instant security value. And then, dynamic analysis, I think it's going to be a dying security tool, because there's other things like RASP and IASP that can deal with the same kind of things. Most dynamic analysis tools could take forever to run, and they're going to throw the gamut at, let's say, a web app. And a lot of times they're just saying the same thing that you're going to be learning with the other tools in your pipeline, such as information leakage and that kind of thing. And those should be policies that are coded in your pipeline as well. So, creating a web server, sparking a web server up, removing headers that say X powered by Internet Information Server, That's information that an attacker will look at and say, oh, thanks for telling me exactly what kind of vulnerabilities I need to look at and the version of Windows you're using. Taking those kind of headers out, these are just best practices that you can look at. The Center for Internet Security and a lot of these different resources are out there that tell you about these, and code that as well. So when you're sparking up a new server, the server is completely coded, whether it's bare metal or it's in the cloud. Doesn't really matter. Just code it up and remove those potential vulnerabilities or potential information leakage points and put that into your pipeline as well.
Great, thank you, DJ. We've got a couple other questions coming in, but I think we're going to run one more poll, and we are just got a few more minutes left. I'd like to see if anybody does have any questions. Just please pop those in so we can have enough time for DJ to answer those. So let's run that poll.
Yeah, it's a great time. I'm right at the end of that presentation as well. I really enjoyed this. I love the interactivity and getting asked questions. I love not just answering questions, but I love conversations. Feel free to DM me on Twitter. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. It's the one I'm most likely to look at and respond to.
Great. Okay, we're just finishing up. I think we'll close. We've got about 59% voted. So I think we'll close those polls down. In the meantime, I have one more question. You want me to shoot that one or wait until we get the polls? Let's see. Oh, no, we got some more coming in. Oh, there we go. All right.
Let's do the question first.
Okay. I have it's kind of a little elaborate, and I mean, this might be something you could probably shoot DJ a DM on this, but he's asking for some advice, he or she. I'm new to the government as a PMO branch chief for USAID. We've moved from our data center to AWS recently. We have a number of high-profile development efforts. How would you set up the green and blue environment in Azure? What tools should we be looking into? What is the basic framework for approaching this? So that's a couple different.
Wow, that's definitely DM me, and I'd love to have a conversation about that, because It really depends on your environment. Like some government agencies, they think they can't do DevOps or DevSecOps because they're programming a missile system, right? And you can't fail often or fail fast when you're launching a missile. They have different constraints around DevSecOps and DevOps. Now, if you're doing something in Azure, definitely take a look at Terraform. I love that tool because it's very agnostic. It's separate. You're not doing vendor lock-in. So if you use CloudFormation or something like that for your infrastructure as code, then you're locked into Amazon. If you're using Ansible, you can't plan. There's different advantages and disadvantages to a lot of the different tools. But with Terraform, I love it because you can create an Amazon environment, a Google environment, something in Azure, Kubernetes as code, like setting up your Kubernetes pods and delivery, all that kind of thing. But to answer some of your question, where I would start would be seeing what the state of infrastructure as code is. I did some consulting for a government agency. It was a museum in Washington. I did their entire AWS architecture security first. That was an interesting one because there was a lot of challenges behind it, and just bringing folks up to what they were doing in Amazon and the best practices for it. Because people would be going into an environment and just manually creating an EC2 instance or creating a security group, or there's the same kind of context and concepts inside of Azure and GCP, but they weren't tracking the change. They were just going in and willy-nilly doing this. It was like a rogue type of approach to development in the cloud. And that's where a lot of infrastructure as code can help you, because if you have a change, you can tie it to the code that's creating that infrastructure. So again, start off with the infrastructure as code because you can create those environments. And we got to the point where we just turned off the console access. So people couldn't even interactively go in and do anything. They had to do it through code. So it's starting to get that maturity, looking at the technique, but also ensuring that the culture is there. From that, start looking at deployment, security tools. There's a lot of different ones. There's open source tools that do a lot of the same thing that commercial products do. The thing I like about the commercial products is that you have the support if there's something goes wrong. Some of the open source tools, they just work and they're pretty solid. Any other parts of that question you need an answer, just DM me on Twitter and I'd be happy to talk about it. So we had that poll come up. I know we have like a couple minutes remaining.
Just a couple more minutes, and I think that's about it for the questions. But yeah, let's take a look at that poll one last time. There we go.
I love superhero. That's awesome. That's where we want to be, right? And
it's at 3%.
So folks in the planning phase, if you need any advice, again, reach out to me. It's going to be a long road. You're not going to solve the whole answer overnight. Whatever you do, don't boil the ocean. Concentrate on one tool at a time, one process at a time, and then start looking at the tools. But do your value stream, look at what you're trying to accomplish from an assembly line perspective. Ford or GM doesn't just say, hey, we're going to put all these tools in and hope a car goes through, right? So do the same thing when you're in the beginning stages. And if you're gaining traction, that's awesome as well. Start experimenting with different things. Definitely ensure that you're monitoring your progress and you have that instrumentation. A lot of times people don't monitor or get that information back to the developers or to the business as soon as they can. If you're a superhero, awesome. Keep experimenting, keep looking at the 3 ways and keep tuning it. Start looking at continuously integrating to one master branch, which is scary. That's moving left real fast. Hopefully that's some advice on this. And it's great to see that people are starting to adopt DevSecOps. 2 years ago, nobody knew what it was. And I was like, wait 2 years. So it's great to have adoption of the concept of security.
Hey, DJ, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
So it's Lisa, South Florida, lost power for half of that. Scrambling to come in on my phone. I love that we live in the future. I wanted to pop in here because it is at time, and I wanted to say that next month's webinar, Alan Nance is going to be, and for those of you that don't know, Alan was one of the original ITIL team in ITIL V1 30 plus years ago, and he's presenting for us on XLAs, which is experience level agreements. So with a move toward digital transformation, we've got to stop reporting and measuring on the things that we have, the SLAs and the KPIs that we've reported and measured on for the last 30 plus years. So it is about an experience level agreement, XLA, and it takes what we're measuring on today from an IT centric and makes it a much more human centric report. I think it's really fascinating, the work that he's doing with it, and I hope you guys do too, and that you'll be able to join us. And then Nicole, are there any other questions? So thank you guys for joining. As always, there's a really quick survey at the end. Please put in your ideas for other presentations that you'd love to hear. As you know, we really use them. That's how we build out our monthly schedule for you guys. If you have to drop off, please do. And Nicole, if there's any more questions and DJ can hang out, I'm willing to learn a little more.
No, we don't have any other questions, but I did want to let everybody know that the webinar and the Q&A will be on our website in a few days. So I think that was it. And DJ, it's always been a pleasure. So thank you for joining us.
Definitely
and I'll apologize right now because I was the recording spot and we lost a couple of minutes of the recording in the middle. So apologies in advance for that, but technology.
Fail fast, fail often, right? I'm actually looking forward to that XLA presentation because we got to readdress a lot of the processes and procedures that we have in place because they inhibit DevOps. We're doing things just for the sake of doing things based on the ideas that we created in the past. Hearing of that kind of talk, I think, is going to be fantastic to listen to.
Yeah, it's really very interesting. He's gotten very passionate about it. And, there's this concept now of digital experience scores, and there's some add-ons or software in the ServiceNow ecosystem that are measuring. It's kind of not the right way to explain it, but almost taking like Network Node Manager from 20 years ago and turning the human being into the configuration item. So, there are tools now, and this is not about tools, but there are tools now that measure all kinds of things about the user experience in terms of how long does it take your system to be able to complete the work that you need to complete, and making, instead of, because SLAs, I remember when they first sort of came about in the industry, because #I'm old. talk about something that we did with the best intentions to finally sit down with the business and align with the business and, make a contract with the business. And then with the speed of which things have changed, mostly because of DevOps in the last 2 years, they've become impediments instead of what we really need to be tracking on. So I'm super excited about it.
When you talk about SLAs, it's interesting because one of the things that a lot of GRC tools do is they lay out the remediation timelines for specific security related vulnerabilities. The ones that I look at is if you're a critical vulnerability or critical issue, something with high severity, high impact, you got 24 hours to fix that. And that's max.
Yep.
If you have highs, it's 90, mediums, 180, lows, 365. And I think those are too long, to be honest. I think those are previous type of KPIs or SLAs. But tracking those issues or tracking those remediation guidelines for time is really an SLA that you've agreed with your developer. And we've never been able, our development team, we've never been able to really do that before. So now we have automated ways to create incidents or create issues or create an impediment and actually put the SLAs in there and start tracking it and holding the teams and the organization to the remediation guidelines.
Yes, exactly. And it's, we can't use what we've used, like we said, for the last 30 plus years, especially with so many organizations focused on digital transformation, but everyone that I speak to has a different definition. Now, part of that's like the great analogy that you used in the beginning of this presentation, which is you can't take the subway from Hong Kong and lay it over in New York and think that it's going to work. Everyone has to have their own journey toward it, but I just think there's not quite enough commonality yet. And sometimes when you start with, or when you consider in the design phase, what matters, what are we going to and report on an antiquated word in a lot of ways too, but what metrics or what keys are going to be important for us for our digital transformation? And talking with some organizations that have spent a lot of money moving toward digital transformation and still using the same metrics, it's the $1 million tail or whatever that expression is. Get that right, and then you can keep improving.
Think of this as an example. If you have a centralized software delivery tool set, right, that's distributing software, Chrome or development tools like Visual Studio or whatever it could be to your development team, and you have to wait for an update on that. And usually there's security updates because somebody has to evaluate it and put it back in again. Like that's one of the examples of a policy from the past. It's great to have those distribution methods for non-technical folks because they don't want to install their own software, but that's going to be an impediment for the development team, and it's also introducing a ton of risk. Think, for example, even deploying Chrome to a non-technical person's machine. This isn't even development, this is just process, right? And if you have the auto update turned off because you want to ensure that you've reviewed the update and all this kind of thing, you're really mistrusting Google's security team at that point. And you're not getting these updates fast enough to people, and now they're browsing with vulnerable browsers. You might have a version of Docker that's in your repository that's 3 years old and you haven't reviewed it. Again, these are policies that have to be reviewed, and it's all the way down in the past that you have to bring forward. Just addressing
Donna was just out at a service management conference, actually at the Help Desk Institute conference. And, a lot of the topics were about AI and about bots. And I think the improvement just in bots where, I see that you've downloaded the new version of Outlook 4 days ago and it's crashed 3 times. Would you like for someone to come help you? From a service management sort of traditional perspective, just the easy and inexpensive availability of that kind of connectivity with your users. I mean, that's like leaps forward from where we were a year ago. So I think it's a very, very exciting time in technology. As I always say, we live in the future until your power goes out because you live in South Florida.
That's what hotspots are for, MiFis, right?
I know. But it happened so quickly. It was like one of those just abrupt, and then I was on my phone, getting in the app on my phone, anyway. So thank you, DJ. I will tell you this, before I did lose my internet briefly, I was looking up words as fast as I've ever looked stuff up. I learned so much today, my head hurts a little bit, and that's my favorite way to be. So thank you.
Well, I think it's time for a glossary. So I might have to put that up. Again, if anybody has any questions, reach out to me. If you didn't understand like a term or what I was talking about with SAST or DAST or CVA or that kind of thing, acronyms, just reach out to me. I'm always willing to talk.
And DJ is right. DM on Twitter is absolutely the best way. And DJ, I'll look at the dates when you're going to be down around here, and we'll see if we can't have an adult beverage or some food together, or maybe even both.
Key lime pie and IPAs.
Exactly. On that note, thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate it, and we hope you can circle back to us next month and learn all about the experience level agreements.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate the conversation and the talk. And
there's a couple of people still on, and I just want to say that several months ago now, DJ presented for us on DevSecOps, but kind of a really great intro to the concepts of it, and that's available in our webinar archive. So if some of this was like it was for me, just a little bit past where my understanding is, I would highly recommend that you go back to that webinar archive and listen to that recording. It's up on our YouTube channel as well.